2023, and I'm honored once again for the third time to have Hugh McCarthy with me. He's brilliant, thoughtful, considerate, and keeps the efforts alive to best help our children worldwide. Hugh, tell us about yourself and about what your project's been.
Thank you for the kind words, Randall. I'm delighted to be here. I think I'm delighted. I say that I'm pleased to be speaking to you, but perhaps not for the reason. Hugh McCarthy, I'm from Northern Ireland. Have been involved in education for just over 50 years, 45 of them in schools, and the last 23 as a head teacher. Towards the end of my career, I lectured in leadership with the University of Ulster. I began this, not glorified with campaign, but I sat on two important councils in Northern Ireland, and I began to, right at the start, to listen to, for example, Professor Lee, Professor Levitt, and began to think, this is a different narrative than I'm hearing. So right from the start, I began to feel all that we're doing to the youngsters is wrong. We should actually begin with the needs of the children. We appeared to be considering the adults first. Had we started from the needs of the children, then we'd have been in an entirely different place. And that we didn't do. So I began writing articles. They're up to 31, 32 published now. Called What Are We Doing to the Children? Parts 1 to 32. And I began making presentations to anybody basically who would listen to me. And like Randall.
Yeah, I'm listening. I listen. I listen and I read. I think your writing is great. It's clear, it's to the point, and it's almost unanswerable. And I think along the way, people, in attempt to answer you, have basically told you to shut up. I think that's always the most telling thing when people try to silence you rather than deal with your points. I apologize.
Yeah, no, you're right there. I have been cut off in the BBC. I'm banned from LinkedIn. A couple of my interviews never saw the light of day because.
Well, that's because you're such a threatening guy.
Yeah, right. Okay.
No, I feel frightened even from the other side of the ocean from you. I mean, that's.
Yeah. So the question has to be asked: why do you keep saying it over and over again? The question has been asked of me because masks didn't work 3 years ago and they still don't work today. So what do you need to say it for? And I suppose there are a couple of reasons. And I'm going to ask Randy to put up the first slide.
Absolutely.
These people say it better than I do.
Yes.
I suppose that sums it all up. That first one, which was Solzhenitsyn, incidentally.
Yes.
And this over to the right.
I think this is Dostoevsky. The best way to keep a prisoner from escaping is to make sure he never knows he's in prison.
Yeah.
Solzhenitsyn, I'm sure, would have something quite, a little bit more up to date.
Yes, and we do. So if you go on to the second one, I'm very encouraged by the words, for example, of Professor Hannigan and Professor Ioannidis, and Randy is going to switch on to slide 2.
Yep.
And that's really what it's all about. If we don't keep saying it and don't keep holding and try to hold these people accountable, then all the suffering will be in vain, and they may well do it again. Look at Ioannidis' words.
Yes.
On the last one,
he's the Professor Ioannidis, Johnny Ioannidis from Stanford. Yeah. He's really an expert on kind of debunking bad research papers and exposing the bias within researchers' mindsets and their data sets as well as they go on. He's been very vocal about this. Across the board, not just with coronavirus. But yes, we destroyed our kids and we can do it again. That is so sad.
And Professor Hannigan, as you know, is Director of Evidence-Based Medicine at Oxford. Mm-hmm. And his partner, Jefferson, is a co-author of the Cochrane Report on masks. Yes. And he's been consistent from the start. It's all about evidence. And That's what they're saying. And Scott Atlas says something very similar then, but not in this. So what if it's over, why do you need to keep saying it? Well, of course, there is an atmosphere, or at least I feel there's an atmosphere of, is it still happening? And these few slides, or those few slides that you were referring to there, and I've got some of the quotes in front of me, Randy. So if you don't mind, it sets up what we're talking about. Why are we doing it? Well, the first reason was we need to record it for posterity. And then the second one is these, in a sense, newspaper articles. That first one, as you can see, is from Professor Biden. There's going to be another. And then the next one down, a poll here in the United Kingdom, 51% of the people thought that the government's restrictions weren't strict enough. But that's only because they don't know the data. Millions of Britons, moving on down there, millions of Britons still taking COVID tests. 40% of them still wearing masks. There's Jeffrey Tucker, about the fourth one down, quoting the head of CDC. Closures, vaccines, masks were all effective and must be deployed again. Now that's the climate. And then the next one's just if you go by, well, I'll read it out because I have it in front of me here.
Yep.
Bill Gates, jab everyone, everywhere, vaccinate the world in 6 months, and this is how you do it. And that's it on his own website. And then if you just go on there, they're now scheduled for vaccinating babies. Millions of people in England will be offered the booster jab. BBC Northern Ireland, testing continues here in Northern Ireland. My goodness. Our own website says why vaccination is safe. It doesn't say safe and effective any longer. It says safe and important. A primary school in England closed because of COVID testing. And if you rattle on to perhaps the next slide, the one after that, perhaps, what that shows is a headline in the Washington Post. China announces lockdown plans for flu as Washington tells Americans to prepare for the same. And that's a Chinese camp there you're looking at. And then finally, here there's a mental health trust in England insisting on mandatory masking. Masks have returned to any hospitals here in Northern Ireland that they ever left. They're still there. So they are with care homes, as is testing. And the WHO recommends masking. And finally, one of my friends went to the doctors or phoned the doctors, and the doctor's response was, "I'll see you in the car park."
Yeah, I think that you have that way early here. Right up here in this one here. I'll see you in the car park.
Yeah.
No, it's incredible. Yeah, I want to come back to the slides in a second, but maybe just catch up with some questions. These are not necessarily questions for you. These are maybe rhetorical questions for the world. The lockdown itself had never been performed as a public health measure outside of 2013 in, I think, was it Sierra Leone against Ebola, and in 2014 in near Johannesburg, South Africa, against kind of a quasi-imprisoned bunch of antibiotic-resistant tubercular patients. Other than that, lockdown exclusively had been a prison term. And basically, both of these things, solitary confinement, which was not used as a word, but is the worst punishment in prison. Lockdown as a group prison punishment. If somebody absconds with something or does something to the guard, the whole prison the inmate population is locked down. They're left in their cells to think about things and repent. And then so this concept of solitary confinement is literally the worst punishment in prison. We took the lockdown terminology from prison. We basically used our data set from a prison government, a government has no compunction about imprisoning its own population. In China, they were welding doors in apartments. A friend of mine in Southeast Asia had another one of his friends. I mean, these are American expats, came to visit him in Thailand, and had a thriving business in China, and had to leave. He says they have everyone's in high rises, and they have barbed wires around the front of the building area, and it's not to keep burglars out, it's to keep the people in. And I'll just maybe layer on one aspect, which is, we had a second type of prison, in a sense, a quarantine boat, the Diamond Princess, out in Yokohama Harbor in January 2020, that had coronavirus literally circulating, or figuratively, both literally circulating through the boat, which shares a ventilation system common to cruise ships, so people share their air. A lot of the rooms don't have windows, and so they're getting air from other places. So this is the perfect experiment, kind of like Legionnaire's disease through the hotels back in the 70s and 80s. And so there was a massive, inoculation, I guess, of this virus of infection spread. And yet there were almost no deaths. There were no deaths on the boat. I think at the end of 3 or 4 months, there were 10 people who died, median age 82. And Dr. Fauci commented on this. He knew about it in February. And yet they went with this kind of unverifiable, unfalsifiable, factitious, presentation of people dropping dead on the street, kind of like a what they call Pallywood, where the PLO kind of manipulates photographs and whatnot. I mean, this is an absurdity. It was comic, tragic theater. Agitprop, I think is the word, agitation propaganda. By the PRC, and I think it was retributory against Mr. Trump, for whom they had, no love lost. Anyway, Dr. Fauci decided to go with that concept of lockdown from China, and with the data set from China. So it's interesting you bring up China as your slide departure, when it was, the facts on the ground and in the ocean, in this case on the Diamond Princess, were clearly at least an order of magnitude, less fatal than that presented from China, probably more than that, more or less than that. Sorry, dangerous. Anyway, I'm done with my diatribe. I just thought you brought up some interesting points there about the way things are, and just, I guess, lastly, my last point is that certain states in the U.S. are continuing the masking thing. I live in one of them. I live in Massachusetts, and as an outpatient physician, I had to wear a mask even if there was a 9-year-old with an elbow problem brought in by a 30-year-old mom, and none of us were ill. And you have to wear a mask the whole time. This is not a way to establish personal relations, with children and with anybody else. I mean, we have faces, we have frontal faces, and we rely on facial cues. That's why we're doing this face-to-face talk. Anyway, sorry about all that. Let's maybe get back to your slides so we can get back on your stream.
I'll just comment on what was interesting about the Washington Post article, I felt, was all the research subsequently has shown that lockdowns had no effect at all. I mean, I think there have been 24 peer-reviewed research papers into the effect of lockdowns. No effect at all on transmission or cases. And indeed, there have been lots of reports, the British Medical Journal, research from Germany, research by the European Centre for Disease Prevention, and by the University of Edinburgh, all showed that schools, for example, had no effect on transmission at all. So to continue to be talking about lockdowns, which of course means school closures, it shows that the philosophy is still there. I think that's what I'm saying. The finance and the philosophy and the people, the central people, still appear to be there. And I think that's what Professor Ananis meant. We did it once before, so we can do it again. Until there is a widespread rebuttal of the policies and practices, we're going to have to keep pushing this boulder up the hill. And one of the things that I'd asked the Department of Education to do, I haven't one of the papers here, was to launch a PR campaign telling fearful parents the risk to children. So parents were schools were closed because of the risk to children and the risk to adults. But actually, the Department of Education and all our departments knew that there was no risk to children because the risk to children from COVID is statistically zero.
Yeah.
Our analysis figures are 99.9997% survival rate. And no healthy child.
It's cowardly.
Steve Kerr says, and Scott Atlas say, and others say, they are not aware anywhere in the world of any healthy child dying.
Exactly right. Now, there are a few cases. There was a 12, 13-year-old boy here who was 400 pounds, 350 pounds, which is kind of an amazing statistic by itself, who passed away. And there are some apparently lymphoma leukemia patients in chemotherapy who passed away, but they were immunocompromised. And you know, you're absolutely right. The cases of healthy children dying from coronavirus are essentially zero, which, mind you, is less than that experienced during a standard influenza epidemic, even in the age of flu shots.
But it's fewer people that died, Randall, it's fewer children that died in Northern Ireland, for example, from road accidents, suicide, and trees falling on them.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that, if you like, that puts it into the context of what we're talking about here. And what I wanted was from my boards, from the newspaper, and from our politicians, was actually just tell the people honestly, this is the risk to your child. And that would have lifted huge burdens off parents sending their children to school or not sending their children to school.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, schools provide that environment where there are loads of children with issues, and schools provide a framework and a solidity and help. Who the children who are being abused?
And it's fun, you know, when you're little, you have a bunch of kids, and you know, a lot of early school is playtime. Another of my friends, he's a tech guy, and he's got a nice job and bright family, wonderful wife, great kids. His older son, he's now still in the single digits, but I think he was, 5, 6, 7 during COVID. Was talking about suicide, like wanted to kill himself. I mean, I imagined he didn't have the means or the carry through, and he's still alive. But what a frightful, horrible thing to do to a life when there's no need for it. I mean,
the largest single killer of young people in Northern Ireland is suicide. And the Indian Psychological Journal reported the highest cause of deaths of young people across the world. The second highest is suicide. Now, I know from my own experience that more and more children were approaching counsellors before the pandemic. Who does a child tell if they're being harmed and abused at home? Well, the answer has been hitherto, they confidentially tell a teacher. And we have, as you do, child protection procedures. Now, who does that child tell if a school is closed? And the answer is nobody. Right. They just go on getting abused at home. And that's a crime.
Yep. Would you like me to return to the slides here?
Well, so I'll comment on this. UK column news. I had not a dream, but an urge to try to put all of this into one place. Mm-hmm. What were the policies? What were the harms? What can we do about it? And so they're publishing a 4-part series. This is part 3. It's currently on their front page. And it really is an attempt to list the harms, which parts 1 and 2 do, but this does a wee bit. and then goes on to list the policy failures, as I see it. So, Randall, if you wouldn't mind putting up the next slide. And
Absolutely. So let me just see where we are here.
I'm on the state of the global education crisis.
Okay.
And it's the slide after that. If it's, yeah.
This one and the
So,
next one.
no, keep going. Yeah, so then if you follow through the next one, and then so really it summarizes the damage. Now, I'm by no means an expert in economies or health systems or mental health, but I can read the data. A million children in England awaiting appointments for mental health children. 50% of the calls to American accident and emergency were from girls under 17, suicide risks. So that's the overall damage, if you like. If you go on to the next slide, if you wouldn't mind. No, just one before that. I have one here, perhaps before that. Yes, this one. As you can see, in the UK, these are figures from Professor Carol Sikora. He's a Nobel Prize winner for cancer treatment. And that's a direct lift from what he says. As you can see, 6.84 million people awaiting treatment, waiting for something from the NHS, and they can't get it. So, all because of a virus, they say. So, if you go on to the next slide, which deals with, as you can see there, look at that litany of disasters, really. As we know, poverty is related to health. The poorer you are, the worse your health will get, because you can't afford health treatment, you can't afford health care. Somebody has to stay off work to look after you, and the family just gets poorer and poorer. And there's that 50%, the fourth point down there, 50% increase in emergency department visits for girls. This is the USA. 12 and 17, you know. Suicide attempts, and that comes from your own CDC. So, if you like, that's a spread there of the horrific worldwide. And somewhere else, I say, it might even be the next slide. And it isn't. So I just said, what do you think is going to happen to education if children are off school? There are 2 million children still off school in the UK. Pandemic's over. 50% of 15-year-olds, I've got the numbers here in front of me. 1.6 billion children were off school at the height of the pandemic. What did you think was going to happen? What did they think was going to happen to the quality of education? Now, the government knew this because Ofsted, as it says, is the body which inspects and reports on schools. It's in England. Ours is something different. But that's November 2020. They're all going backwards. And the next thing, the next one down about the babies, spring 2022. So there's a generation of babies already behind, and they knew about it. So is nobody responsible for all this? And I'll ask the question repeatedly. Somewhere along the line, somebody should say, "We got that wrong." The next slide again goes back to the worldwide. Possibly should have been in a different order, but look at those numbers: 270 million children out of school in India alone. 1.6 billion. These are UNESCO figures, incidentally. And then the effect, percentage of tenure, it's the bottom one. Low and middle income countries cannot read, due to rise to 70%. Now, we all know that reading is directly connected to life experiences, and indeed to productivity, and therefore to money, and therefore to health and well-being. It's a directory. They're not separate. And if you go on to the next one, it's just again, these are from that UNESCO report. And if you notice the title, The Global Education Crisis, that's their own report. And look at that. Just a litany. And notice the Guardian saying at the bottom, a quarter of the world's school systems on the verge of collapse. 8 countries at extreme risk. Now, we may be partly through it, but remember that at least one of my purposes is to try to say this is what happened before, let's not do it again. So when the Washington Post says lockdowns and what have you work, what? Look at the damage they did. And that's why it's important to get these messages out. First of all, they didn't work. Research showed that they didn't work, but even if they did, look at the damage they caused to the young people. So if you're starting as the United Nations Convention on the Human Rights of the Child, all decisions made by public bodies, children should be the primary consideration. Mm-hmm. Now that's more or less Article 3. That's more or less verbatim. So what are we talking about doing lockdowns and masks for when we know the damage? It's recorded. And the next slide, and you don't need to put it up because I'll read it. Robert Jenkins is head of education for UNICEF. Quite simply, we are looking at a nearly insurmountable scale of loss to children's schooling. And I'll add, with all that means across the globe. Now, that's what that report says. Now, these are obviously, and the reason I'm using them, UNESCO, UNICEF, and the World Bank, it's a joint report, actually. These are world bodies. Why are they being ignored? Why has somebody been able to say, well, it doesn't matter what they say. We lock down and mask. And then you go on, and if you wouldn't mind, Randall, and please cut in, this is discussion. So, as I say it, and I'm sure somebody can add to the list. So what caused all the damage? So the root of this article, or if you like, the crux of it, is to try to identify now what were the policies, and did they work, and what damage did they cause? So, and it's not here on these slides, but it is in the article. An itemization of evidence showing that they didn't work. So the fundamental thing was that children are at risk. No, they weren't, as we said earlier. That the danger to others, no, they weren't. And the world bodies are saying so. The British Medical Journal, the European Centre for Disease Control, and the Public Health England, when it was the Public Health England, was saying it in 2020, children are not taking it home and giving it to adults. And then I would add, as I think you did, even if they did give it to adults at home, the adults themselves were young and they weren't at risk either. So the only people who might have been at risk was Granny. Well, all right, come to decision about, as the great Barrington said, protecting those that are at risk. And if you go down to, for example, and then I'll pass back over to you, the particular hobby horse of mine, vaccine passports. Mm-hmm. Now, there was widespread, and I should have it in front of me somewhere, widespread commentary that vaccine passports didn't work. And that came from the all-party committee at Westminster. And I'm more or less going to quote a couple of lines. I've got it here in front of me. There appears to be no scientific rationale. This is Westminster. We found no convincing scientific case that a certificate system would materially impact any future policy decision regarding social distancing. It is clear, it is our clear recommendation that the government abandon the idea of using COVID status certification system domestically. Now, that's our own MP saying that. And it's an extensive report. I've only used a few lines of it, but the article goes into a wee bit more detail. But with respect to Northern Ireland, 5 weeks, £20 million it cost. This is a freedom of information from our own Department of Health. 440,000 a month it's still costing. Now, I know that our people knew this because myself and several of our MLAs, remember MPs in Northern Ireland are called MLAs, told them this, that they didn't work, apart from being unconstitutional, hitting at our human rights and concerns about a liberal democracy, which is a very important article, a very important element. But they knew they didn't work. Now, my question, which I've asked, is we spent £20 million on a policy that they knew at the beginning was not going to work. Yet school budgets, and all budgets, but school budgets, as we're talking about education, are being cut drastically here. So in the world that I thought I lived in, somebody makes a mistake that costs £20 million. Somebody is accountable, and somebody says so, and somebody resigns. But no mention of it. No mention of accountability at all.
Yeah, Nelson Mandela had his Truth and Reconciliation. After World War II, we had the Nuremberg trials. And Eichmann was brought back to well, there had not been Israel prior, but he was brought to Israel to stand trial. This is, there were aspects that border on criminal. This continued aspect of making children and young adults go through a charade, or as I think the UK they say charade, of vaccine obeisance, of bending a knee towards the vaccine gods. Now, I always like to promote that I am pro-vaccine. I think the vaccines have wonderful attributes and wonderful qualities, and in so many cases they are highly preferable to getting the illness. Smallpox was eradicated through vaccine. Nobody wants smallpox. It's highly deadly, and that's probably the best case example. I had taken flu shots every single year. And I've given out thousands of vaccines. I can't even count, maybe tens of thousands of vaccines to children, adults, and all that kind of stuff. But there's a right and a wrong moment for any vaccine. I have a friend who's potentially going to, kind of the edge of Africa, and is wondering about getting a yellow fever vaccine. And, it becomes a complicated question. Where are you going? What type of travel are you doing? What are your risks? What are the risks of the vaccine? I'm not that familiar with the yellow fever vaccine per se, but so I have to go look through the safety profile, and there's ways of making that determination. Should that person get a yellow fever, immunization? Yellow fever itself. I don't want to get too far down this rabbit hole, but the mortality is very variable. In one country, it's orders of magnitude higher than another, but they have different numbers of cases. You're not sure how good the data were, collected and so forth. Anyway, it's a question. I think the answer probably would be, the answer to every question, mind you, is it depends. So if you're going into the jungle in Central Africa, yeah, please. If you're going to be sitting in Cairo, which is also in Africa, but it's not really the same Africa. It's drier and so forth. Probably not. And so it depends what kind of trial. Anyway, so the answer for any of these things is complicated. This is the whole purpose of medicine. Medicine, there's no reason to see a physician as opposed to a chatbot, unless you want some kind of personalized aspect. And frankly, the chatbots had been in some ways more personal than what was the lockstep lockdown approach of physicians who completely fell in line with the narrative. And why that is a totally separate thing. That's its own diagnosis, perhaps. But anyway, so just to answer that question, should you have the yellow fever vaccine? Well, it depends. Maybe yes. I would probably go on the side of yes if you're going to Abuja or Kigali or whatever, and no if you're going to Cairo or Tangiers. So, whatever. But and then it's stratified to age and a whole bunch of other things. And so when you have something like the coronavirus vaccine, this vaccine I think was appropriate and was useful. In particular, if it had been given in 2018, and in 2019, prior, we've always given vaccinations prior to an illness. This concept of closing the barn door after the animals have left approach to vaccination, where we're doing it over and over again, is really a power play in many ways, as is the current masking that's going on in hospitals and physicians' offices. This is really kind of an orthodoxy, and it's funny because orthodox comes from the same root as doctor. Doxy is doctrine, is to teach. So a physician there is ostensibly to teach. So there's orthodoxy, there's paradox, there's these kind of different uses of the word doxy, and orthodox means straight teaching. So if you're orthodox, you're giving the straight teaching. But the paradox is that the doctors themselves, who theoretically should be doing the teaching, were kind of reprogrammed to some orthodoxy which is misapplied. So that's my little 2 cents on this. Again, I think, and then so if you want to further stratify the vaccination aspect, it was much more on target early on. I have this, I make analogies, and I apologize again for hijacking your conversation, but I think it's important to realize, Alec Baldwin, I don't know if he's as familiar there as here. He was on the stage of his movie, and he shot somebody, and she died. It was a mistake, and apparently he's been let go, and charges dropped and so forth. But he has 3 brothers. There's Daniel, Stephen, and Billy, and they have a family resemblance. Now, if you were running a movie set and you said, "Oh, Alec Baldwin's the dangerous one," and you instructed your police with your immune system to not let Alec in. So that's the COVID-19 vaccination. So let's say Alec is SARS-CoV-2, original ancestral, and you're not going to let him in the house. Fine. But your police, then Billy comes along, or Daniel and Stephen, they look like him. These are the variants that come along. They're somewhat Alec Baldwin-ish, but your immune system's not going to really recognize all of them perfectly all the time. Depends on which guard you have. And some of them are very astute, recognize Baldwin-ness, and some don't. And so the vaccine, because it was static and the virus was changing, it became a less and less effective guardian to your house. Again, and mind you, it didn't really matter because Alec and Stephen and Billy are less dangerous than Alec. We're going to stipulate. And then comes along Haley Baldwin, who's married to Justin Bieber, and she's his niece. And she comes along years later. She's Omicron. Should you not let her in the house? Should you have a vaccine against her? Well, she's not Alec Baldwin. She's not dangerous to begin with. She has Baldwin-ish genetics, whatever, to an extent, but she's not Alec Baldwin. Should you care? Should you keep vaccinating against the Haley Baldwin and Justin Haley have kids? Should you vaccinate against them? The answer is no, and no, because, the Haley Baldwins of the world are like the original coronaviruses, which are just common colds. There's no sense to do any of this. And so, again, so when people say the vaccine, was it effective? Yes, it's effective. It's effective early on for SARS-CoV-2, which is the ancestral version let out of Wuhan for whatever means and practice it was. And that's when it should have been given prior. And in extremis, you could have given it, when it was still circulating, and maybe the alpha strain around. But as these other strains came along, and they were much less dangerous, the beta, gamma, delta, so forth, came along, it was less. And Omicron is not genuinely a SARS-CoV-2 descendant. It is its own sui generis, spontaneous version of a coronavirus, such as had always been around prior. Anyway, that's my little diatribe. So what's happening now is that they're forcing people to take literally a 5th vaccine. Now it's bivalent. One is against Haley Baldwin, one's against Alec Baldwin. So it's bivalent for the Omicron and the original. And one is, it's doubly pointless because part of it is against a thing that's harmless, and the other one has completely disappeared.
And my 2p's worth, going back to the children, one, the children were never at risk, so they didn't need a vaccine. That's what the data says. Two, it's the coercion and coercive nature of the campaign. You can't do this, that, and the other unless you get vaccinated. So, as you highlighted there, individuals make individual decisions. It's not mandated. No health thing, as far as I can see, is mandatory, and should not have been in this case, because there were enough questions around this, not to raise questions, to raise issues. And right from the start, the age stratification was there. So why would you vaccinate children? Nobody has yet to answer that. Now, I've asked our Department of Health the two questions. Why are we vaccinating babies? Why would you vaccinate babies? And why would you vaccinate children? Why indeed would you vaccinate anyone under 40 or 45? And according to INAS's data, the vast majority, even at my age, I've got, 95, 96, 97%. So I at my age, have more chance of dying in a road accident travelling across Belfast than I do from COVID. Mm-hmm. So the question is, get a vaccine if you want, but don't make me do it before I can go into my sports club, which is what they did, or go into my church, which is what they did, or go out to a shop and make me queue outside a chemist for Lemsip. Right, that's a good idea. It's pouring rain. I've got a cold of some description. I've got a good idea. Stand outside in the cold rain before we can get a Lemsip. Now, that's where I've been all along, and I've taken actions, made proposals in the various boards not to have this done in school premises, where it is coercive due to peer. It can split schools, it splits staff, governors, teachers, unions, children, parents. As soon as you bring it on to, and in fact, it's one of the reasons why you don't have political meetings in school premises, because they're divisive. And so was the issue of vaccines. It's divisive. But again, if you tell parents that your child has a 99.99 survival chance against this, and there's a risk of harm, according to Asim Malhotra, is it 1 in 1,000, something like that? If you tell parents those two basic, to my eyes, facts, and then give them informed choice for informed consent, what will they do? What would they choose under those circumstances? My big issue was the parents were not being informed about that. It was not informed consent. They were being told. No questions were allowed. The reason I was banned from LinkedIn was not for stating, but for asking. And in my head, I thought we lived in a democracy where, yes, you actually were allowed to state it, but I didn't. I asked the questions. I asked the questions about why would you use masks? Why would you use a PCR test? As you can see from the previous 10 policies. Why would you do these things? Tell me, explain to me. And one of the things I was struck by was a group of people that I was connected with through either Pandata or Collateral Global, were explaining to me why they were saying what they were saying. They were showing me graphs about masks having no effect. As I've said over and over again, this is Ian Miller and Ivor Cummings. Not one country in the world saw, or US state for that matter, as you well know, saw a fall in infections after the mandation of masks. Absolutely. The graphs are the same. So when I presented that to our Department of Health, Public Health Authority, Department of Education, this is evidence. why are you mandating masks? And if you are going to mandate them, tell the people that this is the evidence. The same with the PCR test. Ivor Carrie Mullis, the inventor of the PCR test, he said that it neither detects whether somebody is infected or infectious. And it's certain that's more or less a direct lift. And it certainly doesn't do it at cycles of 45, which is what we were using. Virtually all the scientists that say about these things will say, if you're going to use it at all, use it at 25. We're using something that gets it. And
you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right about that. It's people don't really realize what those cycles are. Each one, I think, is an order of magnitude finer. So it's kind of like when you see those pictures where people zoom out, or they zoom in. They're looking from outer space or from the moon at Earth, and they zoom in and they keep zooming in and zooming in. Finally, they're looking at the individual hairs of a mouse. You can do it, and so that's kind of what it is. You keep doing this refined test. I have a few.
Just come in here. There's a figure that sticks with me, and I've used it before. Dr. Claire Craig, Hart, said you need 5,000 viral particles to be infected or infectious. Now, it obviously varies from person to person. At 45 cycles, you're detecting 5 viral particles, and you don't even know if they're live.
Right. Yeah, and plus there's the additional aspect where there are genuine kind of imitators. The fact that the Omicron turns positive for quote unquote COVID-19 when it is not COVID-19, it's not related to SARS-CoV-2. It is a coronavirus. So, it's kind of like looking out at a parking lot and you want to identify one particular vehicle, of a criminal, and you have a test that will identify cars. Or if he's driving a Ford, it'll identify all Fords. That is not specific enough. So it lacks specificity. The fact that people are still showing positive for quote unquote COVID-19 when COVID-19 has not really been circulating since late 2020 as SARS-CoV-2. It is showing positive for all the variant strains, and now Omicron, which is again a coronavirus. And I like to remind people, coronaviruses, probably predate mankind. They've been around forever, and as long as humans have been around, there have been coronaviruses bringing common colds. And some of them come in like I forget how it is. March comes in like a lion and leaves like a lamb. Viruses come in zoonotically. They come in from another species, and they come in like the lion. But after they acclimate and they don't have an animal host anymore, they have to be less virulent, less dangerous, and so forth. And in order to knock the host down. If a virus is like Ebola and it kills the host immediately, it does not pass around worldwide because the host is dead. He's not around to give it to somebody else. That's like a big game of tag. And so, what you have with Omicron is just the same as what you had with the common cold coronavirus in 1978, 1988, 1998, et cetera, up to 2018. We would never have thought of testing for these things. And you bring up another point, which is exactly right, which is case finding. A case of tuberculosis for us medically has always been somebody who has tuberculosis, has some exhibition of it. And we call them latent TB when they just have a positive test for it. So unless you're exhibiting aspects of a symptom, we're all essentially pre-diabetic. We're all essentially pre-cancerous, but nobody says, oh, you have cancer until you actually are exhibiting some aspect of it. Now, what happened here was a lot of these things were turned upside down, and people were determining cases of something based on having, again, minimal viral particles and or something that was a coronavirus, but not the bad one. So they're misidentifying. So there's a lot of mishmash in it. And additionally, this thing Bayes' theorem, of which I wrote early on in the pandemic, when you are testing something in a low in a low incidence area, you're going to get a lot more false positives. It's kind of like the bomb testers. If you have a bomb tester in, well, let's say if you have a device that tests bombs in Belfast during the Troubles, he's going to come up with a lot of positive, but most of them are true positives. If you have that same guy testing, I don't know, what's the most quiet place on earth? Let's say outside of Omaha, Nebraska, in the same era, you're going to get a lot more false positive, because whatever he tests, there aren't that many bombs there. So whenever he comes up with one positive, it's less likely to be true. And so that's the Reverend Bayes, who came up with that, I think, in the 18th century, and it still holds true.
And a cynic would say, Randall, that if you want a pandemic, you need a test that's super sensitive, and then you need to change the definition of what constitutes a case. A case used to be, as you say, somebody that was symptomatic and in hospital, not just somebody that tested positive. And then what do you need to do to scare the rest of the people? You need to tell the doctors that anybody who dies with COVID is dying of COVID. And then you need to go on to television and tell everybody that was the case. I've got, and I know we're running, this came to me the other day. The calculation of age standard mortality rates for England and Wales goes back to 1942. But every year between then and 2008 had a higher mortality rate than 2020. In fact, over the last 79 years, 2020 had the 12th lowest mortality rate. And we closed the world. I mean, these things seem to have no, of course, they're not getting out into the media, and that's why we're doing what we're doing.
Yeah, no, there's different levels of virus. The first virus is the virus, and then the second virus is this human, mass formation aspect, and kind of really the organism. I mean, we are individual organisms, but we are part of some greater organism, and that's our society. And then there's kind of the struggle to run it. And the trick of monarchs, the trick of tyrants, is to keep people confused and at war with each other. This has been effective in that regard. What's really sad is that a lot of the generation in the press and elsewhere who grew up theoretically to question authority, when they became the authority or they got their paychecks from those authorities, that then the idea was to point their derision, their circumspection, everything else in the other direction. So the guns are out. They've circled themselves, and the people who speak to this issue and who are hoping for a greater representation are the enemy, and that is a sadness. And it's hugely sad that somebody with your intellectual heft, pedigree, rationality, and so forth, and even if you didn't have 100% of all those qualities, would be kicked off LinkedIn, is a sadness, and that doesn't speak well of or to them. I want to. You had one last slide I want to bring up. If you want to address that, and maybe we'll think about closing statements soon.
Okay.
So this is I think your last slide.
Yeah. If it could you just go back one, I think, to
Absolutely.
the list of. Yes. So in a sense, that's a summary of where I am. As I've said in other forums, these were the 10 policy drivers, and they were all wrong. And I mean, I have been writing, a couple of others have been writing too, to our officials here in Northern Ireland. So in a sense, you asked for a closing. So the next slide, Randall, if you wouldn't mind, goes back to the start, really. You will recall, why are we doing this? Why do you have to keep saying the same things about masks and tests and school closures? And that really sums it up. Only public accountability will prevent a repetition. And if you would probably say this for me, but if you are interested in talking about the listeners, if you go on to the next slide, is my personal plug. Those are the 3-part series. They're all on UK Column, which you can see the website there, ukcolumn.org. But the article to which I've spoken at the moment is the top one, part 3, obviously, and then the others are 1 and 2, and they are all part of a sequence. There's a part 4 coming. soon, and I have an epilogue written, and this is partly covered the grounds of the epilogue. The climate exists out there for this to be done again, and that's what worries me. And you asked me, and I'm looking at the clock here. You asked me, are the failure of our democratic processes is a matter of great concern, and the potential removal of them by, for example, the international health regulations is another worry.
Yep. Well, I'm going to just maybe segue slightly to my own self-promotion. So people can find you, first of all, at the eponymous hughmccarthy.substack.com. And you have great articles here. And you can similarly just Google you and find some of the other articles I showed here. This is at ukcolumn.org. And Joel Smalley was nice enough to bring up one of our previous talks, Hugh McCarthy in discussion with Randall Bach about, he says here, you should hear this kind of interview on the BBC. The fact that you don't speaks volumes. And that's doubly thoughtful and pithy, because not only does the BBC maybe not have the level of interview they used to or should, but they specifically blocked you, which is a shame. I've never been on the BBC, so I've never been blocked. Anyway, my self-promotion here is, this is my Zika book. I started on this before this pandemic came out. I started this in 2019 when I noticed that Zika had disappeared. And it was a big deal in 2016 and made all the news. It was the top medical news story of 2016 completely. It was one of the top 5 stories of 2016. It's a long time ago now, 7 years. There was the Trump-Clinton election. There was Brexit and a few other things. And Zika was number 4 or number 5, depending where you look. And then crickets, nothing, silence afterwards. And you have to wonder why nobody and hundreds of thousands of babies were never born in Brazil, and probably 500,000 or more throughout the world because of this alarm. And women still throughout the tropics, stay indoors. They slather on insect repellent. We treat our kids shabbily. These are the future kids, mind you. These are pregnant women. And so, but the whole disdain for the process, and there was abortion recommended. People were told to have a moratorium on birth completely throughout the tropics until a Zika vaccine could be created. Mind you, it's 2023 right now. I'm checking my watch, and there's still no Zika vaccine. So ostensibly, if the WHO had been listened to and followed, there'd be nobody in public school, elementary school in Brazil, first and second grade or whatever, starting, whatever. There'd be a whole absence of humanity if people listen to the Zika threat. So it's not as if the WHO is incapable of exaggerating. It's not as if the CDC is incapable of exaggerating. Dr. Fauci was part of this whole thing. And the weird thing is, as it's disappeared and nothing's happened in the interim, nobody's reformulated, nobody's apologized, and there's been no hearing and so forth on this. Anyway, that's my 3 cents on the topic. I apologize for that diatribe. I very much enjoyed your being here, and hope people follow you along as soon as possible.
Thank you.